This is Jordan. I just put a new set of strings on my guitar. It's some of these Ernie Ball Cobalt strings that have been around for a long time, but I've never tried because I'm easily swayed by guitar-oriented marketing and mythology. I've always been convinced that if something wasn't available to my favorite players at the time that they were playing, that it must be shit. On its face, that should seem ridiculous. And I'm sort of opening myself to the notion of how ridiculous that is, and that it might be fun to challenge some of my old habits. So I've used like nickel-plated steel strings forever, and recently decided to try some of these Cobalts, which have been out for, I guess, almost a decade now. But I've never tried and always just raised an eyebrow at the store. In no small part because if you like read reviews or watch review videos of these strings, people say sort of funny things about them. I'm not a high gain or really solo heavy kind of player. I'm sort of just like a singer-songwriter slash blues lawyer. And I think these sound great, having played on them for probably an hour so far today. And I thought I'd take a minute to comment on a few of the things that people say about them, and whether that matches my experience. First, I think let's talk about what these Cobalt strings are and what they aren't. I don't really know what Cobalt is, except that it's a different metal alloy than the nickel plating that people use. But like, let's pay attention to how electric guitar strings are designed, right? These are like some super slinky, so like 9 to, I guess, 42s. The 3 highest strings they're just steel strings, like in every other set of electric guitar strings that a non-jazz player would buy. They haven't changed. They're just steel strings. They're not wound at all. And as I understand it, the Cobalt and other sort of like technologies that people apply to strings don't really apply to these nearly as much as they do to the lower strings that are actually wound. So the E, A, and D strings are actually where the Cobaltness exists. That's relevant maybe for talking about the first comment that people make about these strings, including Ernie Ball when they advertise them. They say that they're higher output. I think that that is true, but it's really the lower strings that are higher output, because these are the same. But I do feel like I get a little bit more volume from the lower strings, for better or for worse. The second thing that Ernie Ball says in its copy, and that other people comment on, is that like the EQ, the sound of the strings is different than your normal strings. I also think that's kind of true. Again, only with respect to these lower strings that actually have Cobalt on them. But, you know, the sound of wound strings on an electric guitar is a really dominant part of the sound. And I do think that the advertisement of like a tighter or crisper sounding and slightly louder bass and a slightly reduced mid sound is accurate. And the reason I think that is because, you know, I'm playing them in the room, but I'm playing a Telecaster into a vintage Fender amp. And that means that the mids can be very spiky at times. I have to be kind of sensitive about how I use this thing. This has been less spiky since I put these on at the volume that I'm playing at. And I even actually increased the treble a little bit on my amp. And still less spikiness. So you know, it's bright, but it doesn't have that ice picky thing that I sometimes get, and I would attribute that probably to a little bit reduced character in the mids. That sounds good to me. I'm happy about that, given the kind of guitar and amp arrangement that I'm working with. What else do people say about this? Oh, they say that it's good for people who play high gain stuff. And maybe that's like the only context in which you should pay attention to these strings. That seems ridiculous to me, having played them. They sound great, and I don't play anything that I would characterize as high gain. The closest thing would be something like this. Not really high gain, that's just sort of like a classic tone bender style fuzz. Sounds sick! I don't think that I need to be doing anything that resembles a more progressive or modern rock sound in order for these to sound good. I think they sound good. I actually think the riff sounds more defined and like has a little bit more attack than it did on the strings that I was using before I put these on, which is sort of cool, including in the context of just blues riffery. And then there are all kinds of other sounds that you can get out of these. There's guitar strings, for fuck's sake, so, you know, you can like... That's chimey and it sounds good. This brings me, this little like bit I'm playing, which is something that I wrote. It brings me to another thing that I read or saw in a review. And that was the reviewer implied that like, if you are a dynamic player, you shouldn't play Cobalt strings. Like that so far seems ridiculous to me. In fact, these strings may even be more dynamic than what I had before, because when I play lightly, playing lightly removes some of the like, I don't know what the buzzword is. It's almost like a crispy bite on these lower strings. It's not as pronounced. But then if I lean into it, it's got this growl to it that happens when you strum with some more intensity. That's dynamics to me. I think it's a very dynamic set of strings. I guess the opposite of high gain would be to play some sort of like funky or bluesy stuff. I mean, you can play that stuff with these, right? First off, again, if you're playing like upper string funkery, right? Some sort of like chicka chicka, like these strings are the same as in your regular slinky set. Cobalt's not going to affect that at all. It's really just going to affect things that are happening lower. So if you were to play something like... you know, like a horrible facsimile of the meters, if that's what you were going for, you might want to roll off on the tone knob a little bit. That was like full neck pickup, but nobody's gonna shout at you as like not being a real funk or R&B player because you've got Cobalt strings on. So anyway, those are all the things like, oh, there's one more thing, I guess. Some people commented that like as soon as they put these on, they felt like they had more tuning stability. And I will say that phenomenon of like never being like retuning your strings 400 times right after you put them on, that actually didn't really happen with these strings, which was a relief. But then as I played more and more, they felt more like regular strings. Especially, again, these high strings, which are just regular strings. They went out of tune just like any other strings. And the low strings, you know, I sometimes have experienced tuning issues with an A and a D string if I'm doing some like bending on them, but that doesn't seem that different. So, you know, again, in the actual like functionality of these strings, there's a lot that they're just guitar strings. They do largely the same thing. They weren't designed to like transform the kind of music you played with an instrument, just to give you a slightly different sound. And I think they succeed in doing that. So if you're interested in a slightly different sound, experiment with these strings. If you like this, like it. Questions, leave them in the comments. That's all I got for you today. Take care of yourselves. This is Jordan, signing off.